Man, we've been going through this book of 1 Corinthians for a few weeks now. If you're anything like me, you're kind of like, what is wrong with these people? They just can't get out of their own way. They just keep bickering and fighting and doing stupid things. And you wait and go, wait a second. So do we. We've been looking through this with the premise that this 1 Corinthian church that Paul is writing to is no different than us today, the church today. It's a messy place. And you have confusion. And this passage is a little confusing because it sounds a little bit antiquated, but I'll crack it open for you. I'll modernize it for you today if I can. These people are going back and forth on what can we do and what can we not do now that we're Christians. And we talked about the city of Corinth and how it's a mess, this place of Corinth, just like any big city. There's lots of ideologies floating around. There's lots of temptations floating around. There's lots of different lifestyles floating around. And now these people young and old, men and women, slave and master, poor and rich, are starting to become Christian. And they're all getting together and they cannot figure it out. And Paul's writing to them, and he's trying to help them, not necessarily give them rules to follow. He does give them a couple of rules. But he's trying to give them the idea of the gospel, that when the gospel's at the center of your life, it changes the way you relate to everything. And we've seen that in the last few weeks. It changes the way you relate to your body and sexuality. It changes the way you relate to money. And today we're going to look at the way in which the gospel changes the way in which you relate to others inside the church. Especially the people you disagree with the most. See, this passage really is about tolerance. It's about the ability to tolerate others inside the church. Now before I get started on this whole thing, this is not about tolerance of outside the church. Paul talks about that elsewhere. But he's talking about an issue that's happening in the church, which I'll explain in a minute. And he's explaining how it's being divisive. And it's probably not what you've either heard in past sermons about this passage, or if you've never heard it before, you'll be hearing this for the first time, because what Paul's saying here is actually something really quite radically profound about this division that's going on in the church. This issue of people not knowing what can I tolerate and what can I not tolerate. What is tolerance and what is intolerance inside the church? How do we get along with people who greatly differ? Now, if you're anything like me, okay, I've been a Christian for a long time, and you've probably been to church services many times, maybe you haven't, or maybe you've heard of this passage, and if you've ever heard a sermon, it usually goes along the line of something like this, and I'm going to add tones in for emphasis. Usually goes alongside of this: we, strong Christians, should care for the little weak ones, the new Christians, the ones who don't really know their way. We should pat them on the head, hug them and care for them, take them up like little lambs and stroke them nicely. Yes, I'm emphasizing that on purpose because that's not what Paul is trying to get at today. Because using the word strong and weak it's hard. Those are the words. Actually, weak is not the right word in Greek, but it's the best translation that we can come up with English, because English is rather limited. That's actually not what Paul is talking about. He's not talking about some patronizing, condescending way in which I, as a strong Christian, care for you as the weak one. Come into my arms, little one. Oh, let me pat you on the head. No. He's actually talking about something much deeper on two sides that's going on. Two groups of people are getting it entirely wrong because they're missing the entire point of the gospel message. What are they getting wrong? And Paul here gives us not necessarily rules and regulations, but he gives us a diagnosis of these two types of people, which are in the church today, and they're in this room today, believe it or not. He gives us a diagnosis, but then he gives us a cure. He gives the diagnosis of these two types of people so that we know who we are when we fall into one of these groups. And he gives us the cure in the end. First, let me give you context to what's going on here. Because here, show of hands, who this past week sacrificed food to idols? Anybody? Nobody? Okay. Now, because you read that, did anybody raise their hand? No? Nobody snuck a hand up? Okay, good. So this is not an issue for us, right? Food sacrificed to idols. Pastor, move on. Who cares? Oh, no, it is an issue. Because it's still a common thread that runs within the church today. Here's what was happening. If you were a business person at the time, a businessman, businesswoman, if you had a business or if you had dealings to do, any type of agreement that you had to run with another person, The way you did it, you didn't meet in boardrooms. You sometimes met in houses, but you didn't meet in boardrooms or offices necessarily. You went down to the temple. And you ate together. You went down to the temple of the god or the goddess that was the patron saint of whatever you made. If you were an iron worker, you went down to the temple for Hephaestus. If you were a winemaker, you probably went down to the temple of Aphrodite or whatever goddess of wine happened to be the patron goddess in your city. This was the way business was conducted. This was the way networks were made. So, example, let me pull it back. If you make a product called Jiminy Wickets, okay? I know, some of you are like Jiminy Wickets, but at least you'll remember this now. Jiminy Wickets, you make Jiminy Wickets, and it's a false product, as most of you might know. You're a Jiminy Wicket manufacturer. And all of a sudden you become a Christian in the town of Corinth. Now all the other Jiminy Wicket manufacturers, I can't believe I'm using that word. That literally just came to the top of my head. You make Jiminy Wickets, and all the other Jiminy Wicket manufacturers, they go down to the Jiminy Wicket temple because they want to meet about Jiminy Wicket price setting. They want to talk about the Jiminy Wicket market, if it's in decline or recession or if it's booming. They want to pull together Jiminy Wicket resources so they get the best Jiminy Wicket costs, and they save Jiminy Wicket cost savings, right? Now, if you're a Jiminy Wicket manufacturer and you're a Christian and you say, I refuse to go down to the Jiminy Wicket temple because I know they're going to dedicate food to idols, and I don't believe in that anymore. I believe in the one true God. Well, guess what? Your Jiminy Wicket business is going to go down fast. You lose out on social networks. You lose out on potential business partners to leverage cost savings. You lose out on arrangements. You lose out on the backdoor water cooler conversations that other Jiminy Wicket manufacturers are having with each other. I don't know why I'm pointing over there. Jiminy Wickets are not made over there. They could be made over there too. But you see what I'm saying here? It runs much deeper. Now you're starting to see it's not just about food sacrifice to idols. It's not an antiquated issue. It's not something that they just did back then. It's something that happens even right now in culture. There are cultural norms that if you want to go along, you got to get along first. And as a Christian, it's incredibly difficult to understand where's the line. And there was a group in the Corinthian church that was saying, I refuse to go down to the Jiminy Wicket temple or whatever temple it may be. I refuse it. But what they were doing was they were looking at the people who did go down to the temple and did claim to be Christian, and they were saying, how dare you do that? There's two sides to this argument. To go to the temple and not to go to the temple. And what it boils down to, let me modernize this, it means to engage in cultural practices that are normal or not as a Christian. Do you or don't you? And the maddening thing Paul does here, he doesn't tell them what to do exactly. If you noticed, as Joe was reading, it's incredibly confusing what he's saying to them. Do eat it, don't eat it, don't care, go care, they care, I care, you don't care, who cares, who's on first? And yet at the end of it all, your head is spinning, and you're like, Paul, just give me an answer. And he says, I'll give you the gospel. That will be your answer. See, the two people was what he calls weak and strong. And in verse 7, he starts off, and he gives a diagnosis of these two people. And to call them weak and to call them strong, again, is to sort of miss the point. Because it's a way that's almost like you're saying one group's inferior and one group's superior. And actually, he doesn't do that. You'll see, he flips it on its head. And I don't have better words for it, so we will use weak and strong, but bear with me here. When he says weak in verse 7, he says, you're going to defile the weak of conscience. This word weak in Greek actually translates better to unfirm. And if you cross-reference it with other, it's not really biblical writings, but other extra-biblical writings, what you find is it's always describing a person like this, a person who needs rules, a person who needs regulations, a person who needs it to be black and white or else. See, saying when I say to you, hey, this guy over here or over there has a weak conscience, you think they're prone to make bad decisions or they're just lazy or undisciplined. That's not what this word means. I can't press it into you further enough today. This word means an unfirm person who always needs to know the black and white, the do's and the don'ts. Give me a list of what I can do and what I can't do, and I'll be fine with that. But what happens with these people is that with these lists of do's and don't do's, they constantly either feel condemned themselves or they start condemning others. And that's what the weak people in this passage, the quote-unquote weak people, were starting to kind of do. They were starting to look at these people who go to the temple and say, how dare you do that? How dare you break the rules? How dare you go to that temple and practice what they practice and eat that meat? See, these were the legalistic people in the church, believe it or not. They called weak, but they were weak of conscience only because they needed absolute clarity or else. And whenever you desire absolute clarity, you're going to either demand that of yourself and feel constantly condemned that you're making the wrong choice, or you're going to demand it of other people and condemn them when they make the wrong choice. The weak in the church were the ones who hate gray areas. They need black and white. They love rules. They love regulations. Now, I know you know people like this in the church who crave structure and rules. And rules are okay, but the craving after the rules in and of themselves will lead you to be a legalistic, condemning, judgmental person, not only of yourself, but of others, because you'll never be able to live up to the rules. And the minute you see somebody else breaking the rules, oh, how dare they? How dare they eat that? How dare they drink that? How dare they spend money on that? Paul says there's the weak. There's the black and whites of the world. The people who desire these rules, but what they do is they take the rules and they put them on their shoulders and they put them onto others. But he says there's another group, and he calls them the strong. And again, a little bit of a misnomer. They're strong, he says, because they know stuff in their head. Not because they're physically strong, not because they're necessarily morally strong per se. These are the people who decided, I can go to the temple. I can go do that thing with my coworkers. I can go out and do that stuff with my friends, and it's okay because I'm saved by grace. What's the problem? The strong were the ones who were not superstitious. They were not legalistic. But the quote-unquote strong were the ones who were using their own freedom for their own advantage. And in doing so, they were condemning the weak people. Do you see this? And it happens in the church today. You have judgmental people who look at the free-spirited people. You have free-spirited people who look at the judgmental people. And both, believe it or not, are highly intolerant. Paul is actually very critical of the strong, more so in verse 11, because he says their knowledge that they have, all this quote-unquote knowledge, is destroying people. He's saying you can know everything about God in your head, and actually it will destroy somebody else if you use it to your own advantage, if you use it to judge and condemn. See, the issue of tolerance, the strong, they were more tolerant on the surface, right? They could go to the temple and party it up. They had no problem eating and drinking whatever they wanted. On the surface, you and I would say, that's the tolerant one, right? But no, they were intolerant of the intolerance of the weak. Say that 5 times fast. The strong looked tolerant, but they were actually intolerant of the intolerance of the weak, because they said, how dare you tell me what to do? How dare you tell me how to clean up my life? I can go do whatever I want. My body is mine, my time is mine, how dare you? See, they were intolerant of the intolerance of the weak, but the weak were intolerant of the tolerant of the strong. Say that one 5 times fast. Both groups are intolerant of intolerance and tolerance alike, but both groups are intolerant. And Paul says, stop it. You have no idea what true tolerance is. You have no idea what it truly means to tolerate another. Because the self-righteous, judgmental people in the church are going to be intolerant of the supposed free tolerance of the free-spirited folks. And the free-spirited people are going to be intolerant of the intolerance of the weaker people, of the judgmental people. They're going to say, how dare you judge me? And both sides are at war with each other because they're intolerant. And it's maddening. And it still exists today all throughout the church. Both sides, both parties are power plays against one another. Both sides are saying, I won't change, you change. My way or the highway. I'm right, you're wrong. Both sides are at odds. Both sides are intolerant. I want to give you, now I've been talking about it in theory, and you're saying, okay, what are some real church examples of this? I'm sure from your home church you know examples of people who say, how dare you do that? And other people say, well, how dare you say, how dare I do that? And thus starts the battle. There was somebody who wrote this. It was a female writer, and I wrote it down so long ago, and I'm getting so old that I forgot to write down who wrote it. So just know that I didn't write this. So if you like it, you can give me a little credit for finding it. If you don't like it, blame her, not me. But here's what she says, and I'm going to put it on the screen so you can follow along. It's a little bit longer. And here's what she wrote about knowledge and what this does in the church. She says, knowledge about something puffs up. We still do this in the church today. Do you know, quote unquote, that nothing is wrong with letting your kids go trick-or-treating? Controversial issue in the church. How do you feel towards parents who have strong convictions against it then? Do you know that playing Texas Hold'em, which is poker, by the way, with your family members on your annual camping trip is innocent fun? How do you respond then to the wife of your uncle who's battled a gambling addiction and asks that you skip that particular family tradition this year? What do you know about social drinking, or washing your car on Sundays, or watching R-rated movies? And how do you respond to a Christian brother or sister who has different convictions? See, there's a quote inside your bulletin from Tim Keller, and he says this: tolerance is not having beliefs at all. See, people would tell you to be tolerant means you don't hold firm to any beliefs. No, he says tolerance is actually what those beliefs lead you to do when you differ with someone. That's tolerance. And this woman's saying, don't you know knowledge will puff you up? What do you know? And then how do you react to somebody who knows exactly the opposite of you in the church? What do you know about watching certain movies? What do you know about certain customs or habits? Both groups in this church knew things. One group knew that it was totally wrong to go to the temple. The other group knew that it was totally okay to go to the temple. What do you know? And she finishes by saying this: what happens when someone doesn't know Christ is the source of all things and that we live through him, which is precisely what Joe read? A faulty understanding of our secure position in Christ can lead to legalism because they look to proper behavior or rigid rule, following as a source of approval from God. But on the other hand, she says, a faulty understanding of Christ as the source of all things can lead to hedonism because they're looking to things of this world as a source of satisfaction. Do you see? What she's saying is this: knowledge will make you puffy. And we're all puffy people. Some of us feel puffier this morning than others, but we're all puffy. Because all of us deep down have a knowledge that if it isn't rooted in Christ, it will either come out in judgment of people who are on one side, or judgment of people who are on the other side. And she says the single biggest problem is not having that Christ as the source. We're all puffy in the church. We all love to puff ourselves up, wag fingers. And that's what was going on here. Do you see now? It's not some patronizing sense of what Paul's saying of the strong, you take care of the weak new Christians. Care for them. They're falling down. He looks back at the strong and he says, look at you, you're destroying these people because you can't control yourself. And you refuse to listen to them, and they refuse to listen to you. You strongly differ and disagree with someone in the church because you know the right way. Do you really? Paul says. He gives an answer to it. That's the diagnosis. And I know this group, I get told a lot, people come up to me and say, Pastor, I don't like to be put in one category or another. And I say, well, God bless you, neither do I, but I only got 25, 30 minutes, so I can't go through 10 categories. I only got 2, bear with me. But I think you'll know where you fall in one of those sides. And I think you know where others have fallen on one of those sides. And Paul says there's only one answer alone that's going to get you past the finger wagging, the intolerance of tolerance, or the intolerance of intolerance. And he gives it in verse 11, and he throws it in there just a little bit. He digs a little bit. In verse 11, he's talking to the strong, and he says, don't you know that it was Christ who died for your brother, for them? See, what he's doing is he's chastising them. He's chastising them for judging the judgmental. And he's chastising the judgmental for judging the non-judgmental. And both sides, he says, listen, the only way you're going to get around it is if you see that it was Jesus who died for both of you. What that does is, brothers and sisters, if you're on the weak side today or on the strong side, It humbles you down to realize that both were saved by Jesus' death. Both you and I, no matter how much we may disagree on an issue, and I guarantee you, sit with me long enough and you and I will really, really disagree about something. But the gospel's the only thing that says it's not about rules, it's about a relationship. It's about realizing that Jesus died for both of you, not you because of what you've done, and not them because of how sinful they were. He died for both of you because of how sinful you both were. Neither your achievements nor your failures merited his death. He did it for both of you. And this changes the Christian community into being one of relationships, not rules. Do you see now why Paul, he does not give them rules to follow? He basically says, Jesus died for both of you. Now figure it out. The gospel is the only thing that says this about tolerance. Jesus came into our life, and he didn't have blind tolerance for us, did he? He does morally evaluate us. He looks at us and he says, you are sinful. You are broken. You are selfish, petty, lost, confused, utterly absorbed in your own life. You are, he says. He morally places an evaluation on us. He's not blindly tolerant, yet he's not intolerant of that sin. Jesus doesn't turn a blind eye to our tolerance, nor does he condemn us with intolerance. He gives us gospel reception. You see, the King of the universe had every right to come down and look and say, how pitiful you guys are. I cannot stand that. He also had every right to come down and say, I'm here now. It's all good. Let's hug it up. He doesn't do either. He's neither intolerant in the way you and I are. He's neither tolerant in the way you and I think people can be, or we are many times. He's the gospel. The good news that says, you don't get it. You are more sinful than you ever imagined, but you are more loved than you ever could believe. You have to see that Christ completely disagreed with your lifestyle. He did. Yet he came. You have to see that Jesus utterly disagreed with the way you were living your life, and probably does with the way you live your life and my life today. And yet he came, and he died. That, brothers and sisters, is true tolerance. Paul says, your knowledge will puff you up, but his love builds you up. If you tap into that love, no matter how much you disagree with somebody else in this church, and I know it happens all the time, no matter how much you hear somebody say they do something and you go, that is utterly wrong, you will catch yourself. And you will say, he looked at me and said I was utterly wrong, and yet he was willing to die. That's the gospel. Jesus didn't need to win the argument. The cosmic argument of sin, Jesus didn't need to win it. He didn't need to be proven right. He got sent to the cross and everybody thought it looked wrong. And then he won. He won you and me. I tell you this, go with the world's view of tolerance and you'll accept everything blindly. And you'll say, everybody do everything you want. It's your body, it's your time, it's your power, it's your money. Do what you want. Go with the religious view of intolerance and you'll constantly be condemning not only others, but you'll be condemning yourself for never meeting up to the rules and expectations that you have on yourself and others. Go to the gospel as the answer. You find the only Lord and Savior that morally evaluates you, that says, I should be intolerant of you, but I'm going to be tolerant unto death for you. Paul, at the end of this, finishes by saying, if it means giving up meat, I'll give up meat. And no, he's not saying become a vegetarian, although nothing's wrong with that. If you're a vegetarian, don't get mad at me, it's okay. He's not saying give up meat. What he's saying is, I will sacrifice into my life if it means that it builds you up. I'll give up my Jiminy Wickets. I'll give up my time. I'll give up my freedom. I'll give up my life. I'll deflate myself, he says, so that you might be built. Because it was Christ who let the last gasp of air out of his chest on the cross so that I might be built anew. That's gospel tolerance. Spend time praying with me now if you can. Lord, we take time in silence right now to reflect on this. Help us to be people who are not puffed up, but instead look to others to build them up. Join us in this silence, Lord. Teach us.